Hi all, welcome back to Comparative Politics Online. Today I want to talk about race. Like nationalism, race is a very complicated and contentious subject, so please be patient with yourself and with me if you start to feel a bit uncomfortable. And also try to keep your mind open to any ideas that might be new to you. Now, normally I'd begin with a simple question: what is race? But to get to that question in a more fruitful way, I think it's better to first ask, what purpose does race serve? To answer this question, let's turn to one of my political heroes. You recall W.E.B. Du Bois, who I briefly spoke about in my introduction video. In the year 1900, Du Bois famously made the following statement: "The problem with the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. The question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the color of the skin and the texture of the hair, will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization." Now, in this instance, Du Bois is not making a claim about what race is per se, but instead focuses on its utility for larger society. Not what race is, but why we use it to distinguish one set of people from another. In this sense, race is mainly useful as a means to justify and systematize the concentration of power and wealth into fewer hands by clearly identifying who is and who is not excludable, thereby making life much easier and more opportune for some people at the expense of many others. In a world of limited resources, the codification of race for this purpose, exclusion, can and has been a very attractive one politically, as it all but guarantees a select people that they, so long as they are not on the wrong side of the color line, will never find themselves at the bottom of the social ladder. Considering this, we should be very suspect about certain claims regarding what race actually is. What are these claims? Well, let's start with the old and then work ourselves up to the contemporary. For most of the past several centuries, and in many quarters even still today, race was broadly understood in biological or pseudo-biological terms. Take, for example, the notorious Casta Paintings of the 18th century Spanish America. Here you see a proto-biological effort to categorize a highly diverse population inhabiting the Spanish Empire at the time, but there are two important things that you should take note of. First, the very name Casta painting leaves little doubt about their purpose. Well, they were designed to systematize a social class hierarchy for which one's skin color and genetic lineage were the primary determinants of social and political status. Secondly, note what the different skin colors suggest. For instance, this selection of castas clearly warns that what can happen if a white Spaniard mixes with other groups. In print 5, we see a Spanish woman mixing with a mulatto man, producing a lowly morisco, or a Moor. In print 6, that same morisco then mixes with another Spanish woman, and they produce an even lowlier chino. Finally, in print 7, the chino mixes with an India, and they produce the lowliest of all humans, the salto atrás, which in Spanish means a jump backward. Now, a century and a half later, after the Casta painters attempted to systemize a racial hierarchy in Spanish America, more sophisticated methods, born out of the scientific revolution, were used to reveal the supposed essence and meaning of race. Today we refer to this movement as scientific racism, and its flaws and ulterior motives are all too clear for us to see. Nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, it had become extremely popular. Its basic notion, expressed perhaps most clearly in the theories of the Italian pseudoscientist Cesare Lombroso, was that A, human populations are composed of differentiated and identifiable biological groupings called races, and that B, the moral, psychological, and even cultural tendencies of individuals were biologically determined by that person's race. Now, to be sure, these ideas were popular in part because, for a lot of people, they seem to explain the world fairly well. For example, if blacks in the United States were poorer than whites, well, maybe that was just because they were biologically predisposed to resist any kind of hard work, not because of any fundamental problem with the way we've structured society. In another example, Latin American countries always seem to be so politically unstable and authoritarian, thus inviting foreign intervention. Maybe this was because their populations were so racially mixed as to undermine the moral integrity necessary for democracies to work. Likewise, maybe racially rooted tendencies of laziness, excessive passion, dishonesty, and aggression help to explain why so much of Africa and Asia were mired in internecine conflict and poverty. This could explain why they were so easy to conquer and control, and even suggest why they might be better off under colonial rule. But as you can see, scientific racism was a very convenient tool for justifying the exploitation of entire populations, repackaging the so-called white man's burden, as it did, in the cloak of modern science and rationality. And convenience, especially when it protects one's wealth and privilege, can induce a person to believe almost anything, no matter how ludicrous it is. All this is to say that whatever race is in reality, viewing it as a biological classification of human populations has helped to justify and excuse some of the greatest atrocities of our not so distant past, including colonialism, chattel slavery, and even outright genocide. Now, in the time since W.E.B. Du Bois spoke those famous words about the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, our understanding of what race is has changed profoundly. Today, most scholars, and perhaps most people, view race not as a clear-cut biological category, but instead as a social construction, in that any sociological tendencies that we associate with racial groups, such as, for example, relative levels of wealth, health, education, religiosity, social deviance, etc. These reflect not any biological predisposition, but rather the opportunities and constraints of a given social and political environment. All that shapes culture, if you will. Now, this sea change in the way that we view race helps to explain much of the dramatic improvement in race relations in the United States during the mid to late 20th century. It also helps to explain the worldwide movement to end colonial rule pretty much everywhere, which then has, since the end of World War II, led to the emergence of scores of new and independent nation states. However, viewing race as a social construction has not solved all of our problems with racism and racial inequality, much less those we face here in the United States. At its worst, constructivist theory has given intellectual license to some who claim that racism does not and cannot exist because race itself does not exist as an observable biological fact. If you ever heard someone claim to be colorblind, well then you may know what I'm talking about here. At its best, constructivist theory keeps things uncomfortably real. It reminds us that race doesn't need to be an observable biological fact in order for racism, especially that of the institutional kind, to be a very real thing indeed, and to persist despite so many efforts to stop it. So why is racism so hard to get rid of? Well, part of the answer surely lies in the racial stereotypes and biases our ancestors have handed down to us across the generations. These are difficult to extract from our psyches after all. It's what we call implicit biases. But there is also perhaps a reason more insidious still for why racism persists. We live in an unequal world, increasingly so, and no one wants to find themselves at the bottom of the social ladder. Racism, whether or not we consciously attach it to race itself, ensures that some people will never have to end up at the bottom. And that makes for popular politics and policy at all levels of government and society. And that is why I think the color line was not just a problem of the 20th century, but also of the 21st. I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Comparative Politics Online.